The Aurora Bridge was a $340 million infrastructure project and it would not open. 17 structural engineers, the most credentialed in Western Canada, pulled from 4 provinces, had spent 6 hours running load calculations on the eastern expansion joint. None of them had found the answer. The Deputy Minister of Transportation stood at the glass wall of the mobile command unit watching, his coffee untouched, his press conference scheduled for 9 a.m. In 45 minutes, the cameras would arrive. Then a man in a faded canvas jacket walked through the site gate, holding a 7-year-old boy's hand. The senior project engineer recognized him immediately. The expression that crossed his face told the 2 people standing closest to him everything they needed to know. What that man did in the next 8 minutes would change the outcome of the largest public infrastructure announcement in British Columbia in a decade. Stay with this one, it earns it. The Aurora Bridge stretched 1.2 kilometers across the Pitt River Inlet, its steel deck catching the October light in the flat, particular way that industrial metal does when it has been painted gray to match a government specification. The design had been 12 years in negotiation, 4 in construction, and for 3 months it had sat at 94% completion, delayed by a cascading series of subcontractor disputes, weather holds, and procurement failures that had cost the province an additional $23 million and 2 ministers their composure. Tonight was supposed to be the end of all of it. The ribbon-cutting ceremony had been rescheduled 4 times. It had been rescheduled twice due to engineering concerns and twice due to political ones, and at this point the 2 categories had become difficult to distinguish. The ceremony was set for 9 a.m. The live broadcast had been booked. The Premier's office had confirmed attendance. The joint federal-provincial funding announcement, which the bridge represented, was tied directly to the ceremony date. The Eastern Expansion joint had been flagged at 6:17 p.m. the previous evening. A structural monitoring sensor embedded in the joint housing had begun returning a load distribution reading that did not correspond to any of the pre-approved tolerance ranges. It was not catastrophic. It was not an emergency in the traditional sense. The bridge was not going to fall. But it could not, according to the project's own safety certification framework, be open to public traffic until the discrepancy was resolved and signed off by a licensed structural engineer. The project's chief engineer, a compact woman named Sandra Ulate, had been on site since 7 p.m. She had been awake for 19 hours. She stood now near the east abutment with her arms crossed, and her eyes tracking the joint housing with the careful attention of someone who has run out of new theories and has begun reviewing the old ones for errors she might have missed. The first engineer called in had been a W-beam specialist from the ministry's own technical branch. He arrived with full access to the project documentation and spent 90 minutes running load path calculations before concluding that the sensor itself might be faulty. The sensor was replaced. The reading persisted. The second was a seismic compliance specialist from a Vancouver firm brought in because the inlet location created unusual tidal pressure dynamics. He spent 40 minutes on the deck above the joint and then descended to the catwalk below for another 20, emerging with the deliberate composure of a man who has not solved the problem but has decided not to say so directly. He suggested that a third-party review might be warranted. Engineers 3 through 9 arrived across a 4-hour window, each carrying a different framework for the same question. A thermal expansion miscalculation from the summer pour, a shim plate seated improperly during the final deck installation, a bearing assembly misread as settled when it had not fully transferred load, a grout joint that had cured at a slightly different rate than its companion on the west abutment. Each theory was modeled. Each model failed to account for the full pattern of the sensor data. The joint remained uncleared. By the time the 10th engineer arrived, the small cluster of ministry staff who had been maintaining the polite fiction of normal project activity had given it up. People stood in groups of 2 or 3 near the command unit, speaking in the lowered voices of people pretending to discuss things they don't actually care about. The site lights cast long shadows across the deck in the pre-dawn dark, and the Pitt River moved below the catwalk with the indifferent continuity of water that has no interest in political announcements. The deputy minister, whose name was Richard Hallam, had arrived at 11 p.m. and had not left. He was 58, a career civil servant who had survived 4 different governments by developing the specific skill of maintaining an expression of calm authority in rooms where nothing was calm and authority was distributed in ways that made no practical sense. He stood at the glass wall of the command unit, and he watched the engineers work, and he did not say anything. When his phone rang, he answered it in the corridor and returned with the same expression he had left with. He was very good at this. The man standing to his right, whose name was Jason Tully, was less good at it. Tully was the project's senior contract manager, 44, responsible for the logistics and scheduling that had brought 17 structural engineers to a bridge catwalk in the dark. He was also the person who had 3 years earlier made a personnel decision that he had since stopped thinking about, because thinking about it had stopped being useful. At 3:47 a.m., the 17th engineer stood up from the joint housing, removed her safety glasses, and said, in the careful language of someone who has been awake too long to manage subtext, that she was not prepared to sign the clearance documentation based on what she was seeing and that she would recommend a full sensor array diagnostic beginning at first light. First light was in 2 hours. The press conference was in 1 hour and 13 minutes. Sandra Willett walked to the command unit. She sat down at the table with her laptop and her notes and her running list, which she had been keeping since 7 p.m., of every approach that had been tried and every component that had been examined and everything that had not yet been looked at. The list was long. Near the bottom of it there was a single line she had written at 1 a.m. that she had not yet been able to act on, because acting on it would require a piece of documentation she didn't have access to, from a technical review that had been conducted 3 years ago and had never made it into the project's official file. She was still looking at that line when the site gate opened and a man in a faded canvas jacket walked through it. His name was Calvin Marsh. He was 41 years old. He had a son named Owen who was 7, who was wearing a red winter jacket and carrying a small die-cast model of a cable-stayed bridge that Calvin had brought home from a site visit 2 years ago and that Owen had since decided was his most important possession. The boy had learned, over the course of the past 3 years, that arriving at JITES at unusual hours was simply part of having a father whose work did not keep conventional time. Calvin had been hired as a contract geotechnical reviewer 8 weeks ago. His work on the Aurora Bridge project had been specific and limited, a soil-bearing assessment of the eastern approach embankment completed in 3 days, submitted and approved without revision. His contract had ended 6 weeks prior. He was here now because the payroll office had processed his final invoice incorrectly, had been promising to correct it for 5 weeks, and had that evening sent an email indicating that the correction authorization required an in-person signature from the site's administrative coordinator, who was on site tonight due to the ceremony preparation and would not be available again until the following week. Calvin had a hydro bill due Thursday. He had brought Owen because the woman who usually stayed with him on late nights, his neighbor Marguerite, had texted at 9 p.m. with a migraine and an apology. Owen had been awake anyway, had been awake because he'd had a nightmare and because Calvin had learned over 3 years of doing this alone that the most efficient solution to a nightmare was proximity and forward motion. Owen was fine. He had his bridge. Calvin settled Owen on a folding chair near the gate attendant's hut, far enough from the working area to be safely outside the active zone, close enough to the exit that leaving would be simple. He crouched to Owen's eye level. He told him he needed 15 minutes and he would be right back. Owen looked at him with the patient, specific gravity of a child who has decided that his primary job in any given situation is not to make things harder for his father. He said, "Okay." Calvin straightened and turned toward the command unit to find the administrative coordinator. He took 4 steps. Then he saw the joint housing. More precisely, he saw the configuration of the monitoring equipment surrounding it, and the particular way the sensor leads had been arranged, and the position of the 2 engineers currently crouched beside the east face. He saw where their instruments were. He saw what had been opened. He saw what had not. He stood still for 12 seconds. Sandra Willett, who had been watching the site from the command unit window with the unfocused attention of someone who has run out of useful things to focus on, noticed him. She noticed the quality of his attention. It was not the idle curiosity of someone passing through. It was the focused, unhurried stillness of someone processing information faster than they were visibly reacting to it. She looked at her list, at the line near the bottom. She looked back at him. Calvin turned toward the command unit. He had 2 steps toward it when he heard a voice behind him. Marsh. It was flat, clipped, and specifically designed to be the kind of word that ends movement. Calvin stopped. He turned. Jason Tully was standing 10 feet away. The expression on his face had moved through several stages in a short interval. Recognition, surprise, calculation, and had settled into something that looked like professional authority but was operating on a different underlying mechanism. "This is a restricted site access zone," Tully said. "You're off contract. Gate pass is current until the end of the certification window," Calvin said. "I'm here for the invoice correction. Administrative matter, finance isn't on site tonight. The coordinator is. I got an email 4 hours ago." Tully glanced at the security officer stationed near the command unit entrance, a look of the kind that doesn't require words. The officer began moving toward Calvin with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this particular sequence of events was routine. Calvin did not argue. He raised both hands slightly, not high, just enough to communicate the absence of any interest in a confrontation. He said, "I'll come back in the morning. The coordinator will be unavailable tomorrow," Tully said. "Submit a revised request through the procurement portal." The procurement portal had a 12-business-day processing window. Calvin knew this because he had already used it twice. He said nothing. He took one step back. Owen stood up. He didn't announce it. He didn't call out. He climbed down from the folding chair with the careful two-footed caution of a 7-year-old descending from a height and walked to where his father was standing and positioned himself beside him. He was holding his bridge model against his chest with both arms. He looked up at the security officer with the direct, unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned that there are situations in which looking directly at people is considered provocative. The security officer stopped. The site had a different quality now. Two of the engineers near the joint housing had straightened and were looking toward the gate area. Richard Hallam at the command unit window had turned. Sandra Allette had risen from her chair. Tully said, "I need you to take your son and leave the site, Marsh." Calvin put his hand on Owen's shoulder. He turned. "What do you see?" The voice came from the door of the command unit, 3 words, spoken at a level that was barely above the ambient noise of the site, but carrying with the particular clarity of a question that has been held for a long time before being asked. Sandra Allette was standing in the doorway. She was looking at Calvin. Her tablet was in her hand. Her eyes were steady. Calvin stopped. Tully said, "Sandra, this individual is a contract geotechnical reviewer. His scope was limited to the..." Sandra raised one hand. A small gesture. Tully stopped. Calvin looked at Sandra. She waited. Then, because there was no reasonable argument against answering a direct question, he answered it. "The thermal gradient differential between the top flange and the bottom chord of the joint housing," he said. The words came at the same pace he used for everything, measured without performance. In a tidal inlet location, when overnight temperatures drop below 4 Celsius and you have residual solar heat retention in the upper steel, you get a moisture migration pattern in the grout interface that a surface sensor reads as a load anomaly. It's not a load issue, it's a thermal expansion differential creating micromovement at the sensor anchor point. The sensor is reading correctly. The reading just isn't measuring what everyone assumes it's measuring. He paused. There's a thermal mapping protocol that accounts for it. It's not in the standard ministry framework, but it was developed in a geotechnical review for a similar inlet crossing in 2021. That review was submitted to the project technical file but was never formally integrated into the monitoring documentation. The site was very quiet. Not the strained, effortful quiet of people pretending to focus on something else. A different quality of quiet, the specific silence of a group of tired expert people who have just heard an answer that reorganizes everything they've been looking at for 6 hours. Sandra looked at her tablet. At the line near the bottom of her list, she said quietly, to no one in particular, the thermal gradient study. One of the engineers near the joint housing said that's not been tested. Another, a woman who had been on site since midnight, said it's not in the clearance checklist. Sandra said because it was never formally added. She looked at Calvin. The 2021 review, that was yours? Calvin said the geotechnical component. The thermal mapping protocol was developed in collaboration with the structural assessment. It was submitted jointly. Tully opened his mouth. He looked at Hallam. Hallam was watching Calvin with the careful attention of a senior bureaucrat who has learned to identify very quickly the moment when a situation has changed categories. Owen, who had been standing beside his father through all of this, lifted his bridge model and tilted it sideways. He examined the underside of it with the focused attention of a child comparing something real to something in his hands. He said very quietly, "The bottom part." Nobody laughed. But something in the gathered tension of the site, something that had been pulled toward a specific breaking point for 6 hours, shifted by a degree that everyone could feel and nobody acknowledged. Sandra said, "What do you need?" Calvin thought for a moment. "A thermal imaging unit and the site's ambient temperature log from the last 18 hours. 40 minutes. Tully said, "We don't have 40. Hallam said, "Jason." His voice was very quiet. It had the same effect as a considerably louder noise. Tully went silent. The thermal imaging unit was in the equipment trailer. Sandra retrieved the temperature log from the monitoring system herself. She handed both to Calvin without ceremony. He took them, set Owen's chair slightly closer to the command unit where the site attendant could keep a natural eye on him, and walked toward the eastern expansion joint. He did not work in a way that asked to be watched. There was no self-consciousness in how he moved, no performance of competence. He simply knew what he was looking for and he looked for it. His hands moved with the particular efficiency of someone who has done a specific thing enough times that conscious thought would only slow the process. Owen sat in the folding chair. He had pulled his jacket tighter and was holding his bridge model in his lap, looking from the model to the real structure and back again with the systematic attention of someone conducting a careful comparison. He had been on enough job sites to understand that the way to help was to sit still and not ask questions until his came back. The first 10 minutes, Calvin ran the thermal imaging array along the full length of the joint housing, top flange to bottom chord, building a heat distribution map that the site's standard sensor grid was not designed to produce. The image that emerged on the scanner's readout was not what the monitoring documentation had predicted. The gradient between the upper steel and the lower grout interface was 11 degrees Celsius. The standard assumption had been 4. The second 10 minutes, he cross-referenced the thermal map with the 18-hour ambient temperature log. The pattern was clear and repetitive. Every time the overnight temperature dropped below the threshold, the micro-movement at the sensor anchor point spiked, not because of load, because of differential thermal expansion in a location where two materials with different thermal coefficients were in direct contact without an adequate slip allowance. The third 10 minutes, he walked the catwalk below the joint and confirmed the visual evidence that the thermal imaging suggested. A hairline disbonding at the grout steel interface, invisible under standard lighting, visible under the scanner, not structural failure. A measurement artifact, a real reading of a real phenomenon that the monitoring framework had not been designed to interpret. The fourth 10 minutes, he sat on the catwalk and wrote. He wrote the technical summary on a paper site inspection form from the back pocket of his jacket, in the methodical, specific language of someone who understands that an oral explanation disappears and a written one persists. He noted the thermal gradient measurements, the cross-reference to the ambient log, the visual confirmation, and the applicable section of the 2021 Geotechnical Review, including the page number and the figure. Sandra Ouellette was standing at the catwalk entrance when he climbed back up. She had been there for the last 15 minutes. She had not interrupted. She had watched with the focused, disciplined attention of someone who is learning something they wish they had known 6 hours ago. He handed her the inspection form. She read it. She read it the way engineers read field notes, not for narrative but for precision, checking each claim against what she knew, looking for the gap between what was asserted and what was demonstrated. She found no gap. She looked at the thermal imaging readout. She looked at the ambient temperature log he had annotated in the margin. This clears it. If the 2021 protocol is formally applied to the monitoring framework, someone with ministry certification needs to sign the integration amendment. I'm certified for that. Then yes, it clears it. Sandra looked at Calvin for a moment. Then she looked in the direction of the command unit where Tully was visible through the glass, standing with his back to the window. She said, "How long has Tully known about that 2021 review?" Calvin considered the question. He said, "I submitted it through his office." He was the contract manager then too. The routing confirmation shows his inbox as the delivery point. Sandra said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the form in her hands. She said the review was supposed to be integrated into the monitoring documentation before the sensor array was installed. That would have been 18 months ago. Yes, if it had been, tonight wouldn't have happened. No. She looked up from the form. Her expression had the particular quality of someone who has just understood something that makes several previous things make a different kind of sense. She said, "The review that was submitted to the technical file, your name was on it. Mine and the structural leads. Jointly, the version in the project file has one name on it." Calvin did not respond to this. He was looking at Owen, who had relocated his chair to a slightly different angle and was holding the bridge model up at arm's length, squinting at it against the site lights. Sandra said, "The version in the project file has Jason Tully's name on it." The site was quiet around them. The river was moving below. Somewhere on the deck above, one of the engineers who had spent 6 hours on an unanswerable problem was receiving a radio communication that was changing the nature of the question entirely. Calvin picked up the thermal imaging unit. He said, "The bridge needed to be cleared. That part didn't change." Sandra held the inspection form. She held it carefully, with the specific attention of someone who understands that a piece of paper can be more durable than the people who try to bury it. Richard Hallam was at the catwalk entrance when they turned. He had come down from the command unit without being noticed, the way people sometimes move through active sites when they are processing something they need to process in motion. He stood there and looked at Calvin and then looked at Sandra and then looked at the form in her hand. He said to Calvin, "Walk me through it." Calvin walked him through it. He was not brief and he was not elaborate. He said exactly what was there in the order in which it was relevant, in language that was accessible without being condescending. Hallam asked 2 questions. Calvin answered both directly. Hallam looked at the form. He said, "The 2021 review. The joint submission, yes. Is there a copy with both names? The original submission file. Ministry Records Management would have the intake confirmation. The timestamp would predate the version in the project file by about 3 months. Hallam was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the Eastern Expansion joint. The site lights were beginning to soften as the October pre-dawn shifted almost imperceptibly from dark to slightly less dark. In 40 minutes, the first media vehicles would arrive at the access road. He said to Sandra, "How long to process the integration amendment?" Sandra said, 30 minutes if we start now. He said to Calvin, "Are you staying?" Calvin looked at Owen. Owen had set his bridge model down on the chair beside him and was watching the catwalk conversation with the calm, cataloging attention of a child who knows that the adult business is almost finished. Calvin said, "I'll stay until the amendment is filed, then I need to get Owen home before school." Hallam nodded. He said, "The invoice situation will be corrected today. I'll handle it personally." He paused. "That isn't adequate for what happened with the review. I want you to know I understand that." Calvin said the review needs to go back into the record correctly. Both names. That's the thing that matters. Hallam said, "It will be done before the ceremony." The amendment process was not dramatic because Sandra Ouellette was the kind of engineer for whom documented process was not bureaucratic obstruction but the actual substance of professional integrity. She sat in the command unit and she applied the 2021 thermal mapping protocol to the monitoring framework with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every step she was documenting would be reviewed, eventually by people she had not yet met. She signed it. She noted the basis for the protocol application. She noted the source document and both authors. She sent the corrected technical file to Ministry Records Management at 7:12 a.m. She noted, in the amendment's header, that the delay in applying the protocol was attributable to a filing irregularity in the project documentation that was under internal review. The phrase filing irregularity was accurate. It was also the kind of phrase that in ministry language contains considerably more weight than its syllable count suggests. Tully had been in the command unit when Sandra filed the amendment. He had read the header. He had not said anything. He had the look of a man who has been preparing for a specific conversation for a long time and has now arrived at the point where preparation no longer changes anything. At 7:34 a.m. he sent an email to the Deputy Minister's Chief of Staff indicating that he would be taking a personal leave day. At 8:15 he sent a second email, this one to the ministry's HR department, requesting information about the process for voluntary separation. Neither of these emails was mentioned at the ceremony. The ceremony was clean. The sun came out at 8:50, which was a coincidence but a good one. The Premier spoke about persistence and partnership. Richard Hallam spoke about the complexity of infrastructure projects and the teams that see them through. He used the word teams with a specific emphasis that some people in attendance would later find meaningful. Sandra Ouellette stood near the east abutment railing. She watched the ribbon cut with the expression of someone who is thinking about something other than the ribbon. Calvin was not at the ceremony. He had gotten Owen home by 7:55, had dropped him at school with 12 minutes to spare, and had returned to their apartment in Coquitlam for 3 hours of sleep before the ministry called. He had kept the site's copy of the inspection form. It was folded in the front pocket of his canvas jacket, the same jacket he'd been wearing on the catwalk. He had written the forms in that jacket's pocket before, on other sites, other early mornings, the kind of documentation that gets filed and forgotten until the moment when forgetting it costs something. This one would not be forgotten. The call from Sandra came Thursday afternoon. He was at the kitchen table with Owen, who was doing a worksheet about bridges. The school had a unit on structures, and who had been asking questions about cable stayed versus suspension design that Calvin had been answering with more detail than the worksheet required, because Owen's questions deserved the real answer, not the simplified one. Sandra said that the formal audit of the project's technical documentation, which Hallam had initiated the previous day, had confirmed that the 2021 review had been submitted jointly and had been ever filed in the project record with only one author's name. She said that the ministry's records management team had found the original intake confirmation, timestamp intact, both names present. She said that the corrected version of the 2021 review was now the official version in the project's permanent technical record. She said, "Your name is on it. It will stay there." Calvin was quiet for a moment. Owen had looked up from his worksheet. He was watching his father's face in the specific way he watched it when he understood that something important was happening but did not know yet whether it was the kind of important that was good or the kind that required patience. Calvin said, "Thank you, Sandra." She said she also wanted to ask, when it was convenient, whether he was taking new contracts. She said the ministry's bridge monitoring program had a review process underway that had, until recently, been missing a specific geotechnical perspective. She said she was not in a position to offer anything official on the call, but she wanted to have the conversation. Calvin said he was available. He said he'd prefer to have the conversation after the record correction had been formally confirmed in writing, which was a reasonable request, and she said so. Owen waited until the call ended. He said, "Was that about the bridge?" Calvin said, "In a way, about a document that had the wrong name on it." Owen considered this. He looked at his worksheet, which had a diagram of the Aurora Bridge printed in the corner. He said, "Your name, my name," Calvin said. "It's fixed now." Owen looked at the diagram. He traced the line of the east span with one finger. Then he picked up his bridge model, which had been sitting on the table beside his worksheet as it sat beside him at most meals now, and he held it up and turned it slowly in the kitchen light, the way he did when he was deciding something. He said, "Is the real one okay now?" "The bridge?" Calvin said, "Yes, it opened this morning." Owen set the model down exactly in the spot it had been with the specific spatial care he brought to things that mattered to him. "Good," he said, and went back to his worksheet. Calvin looked at his son bent over the page, pencil moving carefully between the diagram lines. He thought about the inspection form folded in his jacket pocket. He thought about a document with the correct names on it, filed in the permanent record of a bridge that would carry traffic across the Pitt River for 75 years. Some things don't stay buried. They wait in the records, in the intake confirmations, in the time-stamped files that bureaucracies generate and then forget, and they wait for the moment when someone needs to know what actually happened and goes looking with the right question. He thought about 8 minutes on a catwalk in the dark and a 7-year-old holding a bridge in both hands, and he thought that sometimes the most durable things are the ones that were never meant to be seen at all. He poured 2 glasses of juice. He sat down across from Owen. He said, "Show me your diagram." Owen turned the worksheet around. Calvin looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up the pencil and made one small addition to the label on the east span, a correction miser and precise, just enough to make it accurate. Owen watched him do it. "Better?" Owen asked. Calvin set the pencil down. "Better," he said.